welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to talk about emotional regulation and specifically around children and ourselves and how that cycle works and how we can learn emotional regulation and the types of problems that emotional dysregulation can cause. So if that's something that you think you would find interesting, that's what I'm going to cover. So that's this video. First off, I guess what is emotional regulation would be a good thing to cover. So emotional regulation is your capacity as a person to manage emotions yourself. Emotional dysregulation can present in all kinds of ways, but generally it's things like outbursts of emotion because you can't hold an emotion within yourself. I don't know if that makes sense. And it's things like having the emotional capacity to deal with various situations. For example, if you had a loss, your ability to emotionally regulate would dictate how much of that grief or loss or anger or any of those emotions you can cope with. So emotional regulation is how you manage your emotional capacity, if that makes sense. What can happen if you are not taught how to regulate your own emotions, if you're not modeled how to regulate your emotions, then you can try and manage these emotions that come from various stimuli from the environment by using coping mechanisms. So things like you may be someone who offloads a lot to a friend and has a high level of emotional support in your friendships. You may be someone who uses substances to help as like a coping mechanism because they distract you from feeling a large amount of emotion within yourself that you can't manage. So things like drink, alcohol, sex, excessive scrolling, all of those types of coping mechanisms. Or you may be someone who dissociates from those emotions in a different way. For example, there are some people who healthily, some would argue, in comparison to the coping mechanisms I've just said, healthily they may switch to exercise as a means of regulating their emotions. They may switch to meditation or those types of things as a means of regulating emotions in some ways. Some meditation can be dissociative, some of it cannot, so it depends on the type of meditation that you're doing. So why am I talking about emotional regulation or dysregulation? Emotional regulation is a fundamental skill that we should learn as children if it's modeled to us. If it's not modeled to us as children, it will impact future relationships. Potentially then it's one of those things that can end up being cyclical. So for example, if you were never modeled it from your parents, then the likelihood is you won't have that yourself, and then the likelihood is if you then chose to have children, you wouldn't model it to them. So it can end up being one of those trauma things that just goes down and down and down in generations. And the quicker that you can recognize if you have not learnt those skills, the easier it is to potentially break that cycle, and the quicker you can kind of start that process of healing from that generational emotional dysregulation. Where we would see in our childhood about how we've been learnt to regulate our emotions, generally a large amount of dysregulation of emotions will include projection. So if an adult does not know how to regulate their own emotions, they will project onto others as a means of kind of getting rid of that emotion. And how that can look to children is, for example, a parent may really need a child to stick to certain rules and boundaries and certain behaviours because then the parent feels that they can manage. So it's not about the needs of the child, it's that the child has to stick to these behaviours, this rigid way of being, because the parent can't manage otherwise. And then what happens is if, for example, there are set rules in the home and behavioural expectations on the child, when the child steps out of line with that, then that in the parent, because they can't manage that themselves, results in anger towards the child and it being the child's fault because they misbehaved, rather than the parent wondering why they need those set boundaries in place to feel like they're able to manage the child, if that makes sense. So again, leading into this, children are just children. They react all the time to everything going on. Children cannot emotionally regulate. They have to learn these skills. Emotional regulation is a skill. So what can happen in a child is, rather than learning how to regulate their own emotions, they just learn how not to trigger their parent. So their behaviors become very kind of narrow, because they become fixed within the realm of what they believe is acceptable to the parent, rather than learning how to manage and regulate themselves. If, for example, a child is getting angry and lashing out, then the parent says, well, that behavior is unacceptable, you need to stop that behavior. But that doesn't teach the child how to regulate the anger and the emotion that's coming up with them, that's causing that behavior, themselves. So whenever they feel that anger, that emotion, whatever, that reaction to whatever stimuli it was, that anger gets held within, because they know that it's not acceptable to behave in the way that they did naturally, which was to lash out or whatever, and they don't know how to regulate the anger within their own system, so they will just hold it, because they're not taught an alternative way of being. And there are ways of mitigating that, and maybe that's something I'll cover in another video in terms of how to help your child with emotional regulation. But a lot of it is actually building the capacity in people to be able to manage more emotions. So that's an example of how that may show up in a kind of child's life or in a parent's life. But in a general day-to-day life, it's things like something happening in somebody else's life or in somebody else's behavior, and it causing in you a reaction that you then see that person as being at fault. And it's an inability to recognize the emotions that are being caused by a situation, and being able to manage your own feelings on a situation without pushing the blame onto others. So again, that's what you see with children, obviously. Well, it's the child's fault that I'm angry because they misbehaved, rather than I can feel that I'm getting angry myself. That child is just being a child. So what can I do to manage this anger within myself? And also, how can I support my child with managing how they're feeling at the moment and the emotions that are coming up for them? So that's a kind of regulated way of looking at it. Like I said, I've used the child-adult dynamic again there, but you can relate it to relationships in adulthood. You know, for example, well, you did this and that made me really angry and it's your fault, rather than, when you did this, I felt like this, and this is coming from here, and that's contributing to it, and it's not what you've done that's making me angry. It's, you know, it comes from within. Like, we create our own worlds. Emotional regulation generally means that you're calming the nervous system down. So a lot of emotional regulation is based around kind of the flight or fight response. If this emotion hits you, you can't manage it, you want to get rid of it, or you want to argue against it, like it's too much for you to manage. And I used before an example of if you have a loss. So if you have a loss and you have this huge amount of various feelings that can hit you, you know, anger, grief, denial, all of this kind of stuff, it can be overwhelming. And if you have a low capacity to regulate your emotions, then that's just going to be more overwhelming. You're going to have less capacity to be able to manage those very big emotions, which is why at those very difficult, huge events in our lives, that can be a lot harder if you're not used to emotionally regulating, and people can struggle massively. Now, I'm not saying that you're not going to struggle, because absolutely it's going to be really difficult with any loss or any major life event in that way. I'm just using that as an example. In terms of processing that loss, the greater your capacity to hold emotions and to manage your own emotions, the more that processing is going to be allowed to happen. And I think I covered this in my video on the loss cycle anyway, but using loss as an example, the loss cycle your body needs to work through anyway. It kind of needs to go full circle with that. If you're using coping mechanisms that are very dissociative and that aren't allowing you to work through those things, it can take a lot longer to process and go through. Now, there's no judgment on that. You know, at the end of the day, people work through things in the way that is best for them. But it is something to bear in mind that if you increase this capacity for emotions to be able to hold them, manage them yourselves, then you're less likely to kind of damage relationships and stuff that are important to you. You know, nobody is perfect at all. Everybody makes mistakes, and emotional dysregulation is linked very heavily to needing things to be a certain way, because that's how you feel comfortable and safe, and that's how you can manage your emotions. And it can mean that, for example, if you have a friendship that means a lot to you, if you end up having an argument or something else is going on, I don't know, you can't manage your emotions, so you get very angry with them, you could potentially ruin an entire friendship because one or both of you or whatever is dysregulated. So as I said before, children can't regulate emotions. It's not a skill that we're born with, it's something that we learn, and we learn it from our caregivers. Now, if as a child you are just reacting to stuff, kids just, something happens, they get angry, they fall over, they hurt themselves. Now, if, for example, a child falls over and hurts themselves and is told, don't cry, then you are effectively cutting off the emotional response to that stimuli. You're telling that child that, and this is a systemic thing, so if you continually say it, if it continually goes in, if this child learns that when they hurt themselves, they shouldn't cry, then they are stopping their own natural emotional response to that. Now, the body's way of managing, oh, that hurts, is to cry. You sit with that really hurt, and then, the emotion goes away. You work through it, you process the feeling, and it passes. Now, if you're taught that don't cry, then the most important thing becomes, as a survival thing for a child, to please their caregiver, because obviously in terms of biological psychology, that caregiver is responsible for the survival of that child. So meeting the needs of a caregiver is like number one priority for a child. Now, if you have a caregiver that instead sits with you and says, I can see that really hurt, I can see that hurt, you're crying. Being able to cry and it being okay to cry means that child can then process that reaction, that emotion, and they can respond and feel in themselves that when I get hurt and I cry, that's okay. I'm seen, I'm heard, I'm loved, and I can feel that emotion, and that emotion then passes. It creates emotional regulation within the child. So I guess what I'm getting at here, what this video was about, even though I understand I've been a bit rambly throughout that, was that emotional regulation is a vital skill. Improving your emotional capacity is a vital skill to be able to experience the world in ways that are possibly more connective to who you really are. I don't think anybody wants to be projecting left, right and centre, ruining friendships and invalidating feelings. And most of the time, from a professional point of view, my role is about validating feelings. There are hundreds of people that go to therapy and will sit in therapy and say, this happened and I got really angry, and then try and basically shit on themselves for feeling angry because they think it's not appropriate. And a huge amount of time in therapy is spent saying, look at what actually happened in that situation. Do you not think that anger is an appropriate reaction to have, or that it's appropriate for you to be hurt by this? The amount of times that I hear people say that, basically judging themselves and saying that they shouldn't be feeling the way that they're feeling. And it's like, well, you are feeling that way, but it's very, very clear that people are taught that, oh, I shouldn't feel that way, and that it's not acceptable to feel that way, when actually just the fact that you feel that way should be enough for it to be acceptable, because all feelings are valid. And most of the time, feelings come up in response to external stimuli. And when you break it down and say, right, so you had this, and this happened, do you not think it's okay to be upset, to be angry, to be sad, to be, all of these things? I spend a huge amount of my life validating people's feelings, because all feelings are okay. But if you've never learned that, then it can be really, really difficult, because not only are you trying to manage the feeling that you feel, but issues develop when you're trying to manage the judgment that you have over the feelings that you feel. So feeling that they're not acceptable, feeling that you shouldn't be feeling that way, and all of that stuff, that becomes way more of a problem over just feeling how you feel. I don't know if that makes sense, but thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked this video, if you like my channel, please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. That would be awesome, but there's absolutely no pressure, and I will catch you in the next one.